From the American Neurological Association, I'm Adeline Goss. This is A&A Investigates. The recent FDA approval of Lecanemab, an amyloid-sequestering agent, has been hailed as a breakthrough in the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. But critics of the drug have pointed to its cost, risks, and treatment burden. Now that Lecanemab is being administered in clinics across the country, how is it changing the lives of people with Alzheimer's and their families? Dr. Richie, neurohospitalist at UCSF, spoke to Dr. Seth A. Gale, co-director of the Brain Health Program and assistant professor of neurology at Harvard Medical School. Dr. Gale has been involved in creating the clinical program that's delivering Lecanemab to patients at Brigham and Women's Hospital and Massachusetts General Hospital, with the first patients receiving the drug this month. Here's Megan.
Welcome, Dr. Gale. Thanks so much for coming.
Thanks for having me. I look forward to talking about this.
All right. So, Dr. Gale, for those of us who aren't behavioral neurologists, could you briefly summarize the findings of the phase 3 trial, Clarity, that led to FDA approval of Lecanemab?
Of course. I appreciate starting from the beginning here. I think that's important. So the Clarity study was a phase 3 trial of Lecanemab. Lecanemab has been in development for years. And I think it's important to recognize that the class of medications here, which is anti-amyloid monoclonal antibodies, that there are a number of them. And, Lecanemab is the first one to receive full FDA approval, which happened in July of this year. But other medications that are close to approval or submission to the FDA. And in 2021, people may know that the monoclonal antibody aducanumab received a conditional kind of accelerated approval through the FDA. But this medication, Lecanemab, really had received not only the first FDA full approval in July of this year, but had a fair consensus in the research world that the outcome showed benefit. Essentially, I can talk about that. So the Clarity study was a 18-month double-blind randomized placebo-controlled trial and enrolled about 1,800 people. And the primary outcome of the Clarity study was a rating scale that we call the Clinical Dementia Rating Scale, or the CDR scale, which is a metric of daily functioning. And the population that was enrolled were people who had mild cognitive impairment or mild dementia due to Alzheimer's disease, age range of 50 to 90. And the primary outcome for the study was that there was a difference between Lecanemab versus placebo on the CDR scale. Mean change from baseline on that endpoint between Lecanemab and placebo was modest. It was only 0.45 points on a scale from 0 to 18. Nevertheless, it was positive. And so that's what led to the approval of the drug. I think you hinted a little bit about debate, or at least in the intro of this, about what that means. And, is it meaningful and et cetera. And we can talk about that a little bit, but for sure, there was consensus that this study was well designed and that both with the primary outcome, which was the daily functioning measure I mentioned, as well as the cognitive outcomes and the biomarker outcomes, were all positive. And so that was a real breakthrough for the community.
It's so important for us to really understand the outcomes of a trial in the advent of a new drug. And so thanks for going through those details. If I'm not mistaken, you've been involved in setting up the Lecanemab clinical program at Brigham and Women's Hospital and Massachusetts General Hospital. Tell me about the general approach that your program has been using to begin to set up patients for Lecanemab infusions.
So we sort of thought about it like a Coumadin clinic model. There'd be this separate sort of clinic that's dedicated to all of the safety and monitoring issues that goes into a new medication. So we developed this program that we were calling the Alzheimer's Therapeutic Program, or ATP clinic. And what that means is that there are separate intake visits for patients who are referred within our health system through the, referral, like electronic medical record referral, to have the necessary evaluation to even kind of take the first step towards lecanemab treatment. So right around the time of the approval of lecanemab, there was a consensus that was published by a group of experts in the field, many who do research in this class of drugs. That paper, which is by Jeff Cummings et al., is called The Appropriate Use Criteria for Treatment of Lecanemab. So what we did at our center was we looked at that eligibility criteria. Those are sort of appropriate use recommendations, which include eligibility for the drug. And we thought about our own, with input from our own researchers who worked on the Clarity trial, and sort of came up with what we felt comfortable with as a center for eligibility. We created really a checklist criteria for referring clinicians that would help us in that first visit to our therapeutic program clinic. So for example, patients have to have a clinical diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment or mild dementia due to Alzheimer's disease. It has to be corroborated by a biomarker, so a beta amyloid positive biomarker, so either by spinal fluid or by amyloid PET scan. It's a little challenging. People may know that getting amyloid PET done in a clinical setting, it's been used for a while, but it's starting in larger scale now because payers like Medicare are covering this test. So that makes it easier. We gave certain parameters of scores on cognitive tests and functional metrics, on daily functioning metrics that mimic the population of folks who were in the Clarity study. So that's kind of a little bit about eligibility. And that also includes, by the way, ApoE, or the gene called ApoE, which is a risk factor gene for Alzheimer's, which with a certain copy, with a certain allele, an E4 allele, people have a higher risk of side effects for lecanemab. So having that information going into the decision-making or the consenting for the drug matters, because you have to consider it in risk profiling for the side effects. And there's been a discussion with them, as well as a consent form that we thought was appropriate because of all of the necessary safety monitoring and other details of this drug.
I'm curious then, what do you anticipate that the infusion process for lecanemab will look like? How long does it take? What does the center kind of look like? Tell me about the whole experience.
I think that the experience will be similar to patients who arrive, for example, at like a cancer infusion center, if people can imagine that, or for our colleagues in the MS world, multiple sclerosis world, that deal with infusions. And I think I should just point out that, this medication, from the patient perspective, it's not a trivial treatment, in the sense that, first of all, it's given every 2 weeks. The plan is to mimic what was done in the Clarity trial. So for every 2 weeks, patients will come from, around the area, which for us can span for, hours away. And people come in every 2 weeks for 18 months. So just that alone, the weighing the logistics versus the benefits and the risks are not trivial. The actual medication is given over about an hour. The plan is to have an observation period of a couple of hours, just like we do when we give these drugs in clinical trials. And that's just to observe for infusion reactions, kind of local allergic type reactions, things like temperature increase or headache or blood pressure changes, etc. For this medication, they're up to 25% actually. People have usually minor infusion reactions.
Thank you so much. That's really helps to paint a picture of what the infusion may really look like for someone who's thinking about taking their family member or going. Several times now during our discussion, you've mentioned a number of different factors that really are relatively complex when it comes to setting up lecanemab infusions. There's a huge process by which it gets considered for each individual patient. There's genetic testing for ApoE4, as well as the potential long distance to reach an infusion center and to be there every 2 weeks. So it sounds as though there are actually quite a lot of costs associated with administering lecanemab. And I'm wondering, in your opinion, do you think these costs will lead to inequity or worsening inequity in the treatment of patients with MCI and with Alzheimer's?
So I think that's a really important question. We have been, and I think many in the field have been concerned and worried about that. One of the challenges thinking about this issue with our system, and I think like with many systems, is that, we have these two flagship hospitals that are part of this larger health system. And to start, we conceptualize as starting out with the infusions happening at these two centers. But very soon, we want to be able to get this medication and all the infrastructure related to it outside of these two flagship hospitals. So that's just, one piece of it. The other thing that comes to mind is that generally for access, I think that having relationships with community health centers that we try to do in our center, pathways to improve representation for clinical trials have been developed in order to try to connect to populations who might not be part of clinical trials historically. Those are the same populations that we want to reach, and want to provide access for lecanemab. And so we have some of those relationships, but I think really doubling up on education in those communities related to this drug and related to what it's going to be like to take this medication, what it requires, is really important. And we've started to do some of that. And I'm hoping that with that kind of knowledge, even as we start out giving this medication just at these two centers, we'll be able to facilitate, not just the population that comes to our clinic necessarily, our subspecialty clinic, but really folks outside of the hospitals as well.
So it does sound like there's really quite a need to increase access and increase the number of infusion centers that are going to be available to patients. And so I'm wondering, taking the perspective of healthcare providers, healthcare systems who are interested in developing these infusion centers for their community, what would you say some of the challenges as well as solutions that these centers might face in developing the infusion centers are? I'm talking about questions like reimbursement or the investment upfront for the healthcare system, accessibility, that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I can share a little bit of our experience, and hopefully that, could be helpful for others. We had a little bit of a bottom-up approach in the sense that our clinicians started to discuss, what is this going to look like? And, how can we start planning for it? What personnel changes do we need? Those kinds of things. And we then went to our department. We're at an academic medical center, obviously, and sort of discussed with them and, got to clinical leadership above the department in our institution a little bit later. And I think one way to go about it is to sort of think together with clinical leadership or business development folks in an academic center or even a private clinic from the beginning, because then as things arise, as you figure out what payers are going to cover for this, which again, I'll just mention is really ongoing, right? We really don't know what plans will cover the cost of this medication yet. Medicare has definitely publicly announced that they'll cover 80% of the annual fee for cost of this medication. Secondary insurances are going to have to cover the rest. But in essence, all of those questions about payment and including for the drug and for testing, working them through from the beginning with clinical leadership or infrastructure is important. I think also to mention that the bandwidth or the capacity, I should say, for doing additional MRI scans that need to be done for monitoring of this medication, the genetic testing we mentioned, the PET scans, and potentially spinal fluid testing, all of that takes a real planning and collaboration that is, outside of the day-to-day kind of clinical work that we do. So again, I think the key is that if you understand what is needed and sort of take a step back to think through all of the infrastructure, I think you'll be in a much better place to sort of start from the beginning with everyone.
So I think once or twice during our discussion so far, you've talked about surveillance MRI scans. And I think what you're referring to is sort of one especially important adverse effect of the anti-amyloid immunotherapies in general, which is the condition known as ARIA. And ARIA, I understand, stands for amyloid-related imaging abnormalities. Basically, as the immune system clears out the amyloid protein, the patients that are receiving therapies like lecanemab can develop cerebral edema, hemorrhage from ARIA. And I just would love for you to comment, how common is ARIA and what is your center's process for monitoring for it?
Right. That's a great question. So in fact, a lot of the reason for the monitoring that I'm alluding to and just this infrastructure in general is because of this side effect of ARIA. So for lecanemab from the Clarity trial, there was about a 13% rate of edema, or what we call ARIA-E. Edema is swelling. And for ARIA-H, or hemorrhage, the rate was about 17%. So not trivial, but also, not a deal breaker for patients considering things. And I should mention a couple nuances to this. So these are what we're talking about are small microbleeds or small areas of swelling or inflammation in the brain that we think are due to the activity of this agent that is binding to these bad actors and causing inflammatory cells to come around and have kind of local inflammatory response. But most of this side effect of ARIA is asymptomatic. So about 75% just happen. And in fact, is not a reason to stop the medication, especially if it's what we would describe as mild. So the reason for surveillance MRIs is just to detect this finding because it's mostly asymptomatic. When it's symptomatic, the remaining 25%, it's usually minor neurologic symptoms like headache or more confusion, acute confusion on top of cognitive impairment, visual changes, etc. And of course, there are rare circumstances where people have significant and ongoing neurologic complaints like that. But those are uncommon. So that's the kind of background there.
So ARIA is certainly one risk that the patients and families need to be aware of. And furthermore, there's coming in for infusions every 2 weeks, right? That sounds like it's going to be for a long time too. And that's no small feat. So I'm wondering, how do you find that patients and families are navigating all this complexity? How are they weighing the pros and cons of considering lecanemab?
I think that there's been a lot of discussion about the meaningfulness of the outcomes of the trial and therefore like the meaningfulness of the drug. And I think there's a lot of people who are looking for, appropriately, both providers and patients, for anything in this disease, right, that can sort of slow the decline or stabilize the disease or even have a positive impact on the underlying biology. And so a fair amount of patients that come to attention or hear about this drug or that we talk about this drug with, are saying, sign me up, where can I go? I'll go anywhere. I'll take this medication. So, even if there's a 25% rate of decline compared to not taking this drug, so I'm still going to decline, like I want something. And I think there are other people who, may know less about it or think about the pros and cons overall. And, they hear things like, well, I might progress to the next stage of the disease only 5 months earlier, or 5 months later than I would have without the drug. Is that going to be noticeable? Is that worth it? Should I have to come from northern New Hampshire to Boston every 2 weeks to get this medication for that kind of outcome? And I think it's a complicated and ongoing discussion. I think on the one hand, I can check my biases as a provider at the door here and say, we don't really know what happens after 18 months for this drug. We have some data from the trial now at 2 years for people who stayed on the drug, but we don't really know if people will maintain this difference of decline, if the positive effect on the underlying biology is beneficial, that the disease will stop or slow down further after 18 months. There's a lot of uncertainty, right? So my bias would be that if it's reasonably doable, even with some sacrifices. And of course, we talked about the cost a little bit, but if the costs line up in a way where patients don't have to pay tremendous amounts out of pocket because payers are stepping up to cover this drug, then yeah, it's reasonable if those factors line up. And I think I would, I recommend it. But I can totally understand, and I've already had some of these conversations with patients, how the logistics are challenging, the actual observed benefit isn't clear, the cost may be a lot. This is not a slam dunk. This is not a cure. So I totally understand both of these sides. And I think we're going to get a bunch of real world experience and evidence in the next 6 months, 1 year, to inform those decisions, to make us better as providers and hopefully more helpful to patients about them.
Well, I love what you just said there. It really helps to paint a picture of the extreme complexity in this decision process. So thank you. It has been so interesting to talk to you about Lecanemab, and I'm so grateful for all the insights that you shared. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you. It was great to be here. I enjoyed the conversation, and I hope it was helpful to all the listeners.
That was Dr. Seth A. Gale, interviewed by Dr. Megan Richie. ANA Investigates is the official podcast of the American Neurological Association. The show's producers are members of the ANA Education Innovation Committee, chaired by Michelle Johansson. I'm Adeline Goss, podcast host and executive producer. Our program was produced today by Masoom Desai, Caitlin White, and me, with help from Jen Hurley. You can listen to past episodes of the show, subscribe to us so you never miss an episode, and access all of the ANA's educational programs on the Education tab at myana.org. That's it for ANA Investigates. See you next month.